Good afternoon and welcome to the Lunchtime Series with me, Kevin Britz, leading the charge with insights, information, and ultimately effective results. Joining me in today's marketing and leadership segment, marketing and communications expert and co-host Craig Pagely. How are you doing, Craig?
Kevin, I'm great, thanks. I hope you're doing well. And here we are on the 185th episode of our Lunchtime and Marketing Leadership Series. Can you believe it?
Strangely enough, I don't know if I mentioned to you this recently, but someone was mentioning the importance of creating content. And I mean, you and I at 185 shows, we obviously going strong here. But someone mentioned on a reel or a TikTok or a something that the future of creating, where the future of content is lying, is content is going to eventually become real estate. And I was like, that's the comparison they were making. That's your content. And she was a lawyer, and she was saying she's taking YouTube channels and putting that into family trusts for families, because the content of a channel is becoming such a big thing where content is king. I was like, holy shit! Like, well, clearly we are ahead of the game here, Craig. So I'm so proud that we at 185. It's amazing.
What's really interesting is that obviously, you know, not all of this is our own user-generated content. This is about conversation around great pieces of content that does exist there, and reports and things like that. But most definitely the interpretation, the sharing. This is an amazing platform that's getting the content out there, and that's what I'm really happy about in what we are achieving.
And I've also started. I don't know if you've seen, but I haven't actively been SEOing the YouTube channels, but I am or the YouTube channel itself. But we are now doing it. It's officially from the 1st of November. So, and we are gaining some serious traction on numbers. And I was doing a sort of a proposal for sponsorship for the show, and you won't believe we've had over 184,000 downloads of the Lunchtime Series.
That's phenomenal.
At over 8,000 hours of view time. So when you hear it in like numbers, because these are stats directly from YouTube.
Yes.
You're going, holy crap! Like it's not something I've paid attention to, but now that I am, it's pretty impressive. So I'm glad that we're doing this, and it's
fantastic.
Looking forward to it. Craig, so following on the previous report we covered, what do you have in store for today's conversation?
So Kevin, yeah, we had a great conversation the last two episodes where we covered the content content from the article that I came across on McKinsey.com titled "Go Teams." When teams get healthier, the whole organization benefits. So moving from a team focus approach last two conversations, I actually thought let's sort of, hone in a little bit and look at a leadership focus for today and discuss some key points highlighted in an interesting book summary that I came across titled The Dichotomy of Leadership. And there are 4 themes in this book, and we're going to get you 2 of them today. But yeah, it's a fascinating introduction to the principle of this book. The book was written by Jocko, Willink, and Leif, Babin. And the book summary was produced by Paul Miners, and we've addressed 1 or 2 other book summaries by Paul Miners. He definitely is running a good little content platform there where he helps put effort into summarizing reams of content from the various books and really just distills them into some fantastic standout key points and some great takeaway summaries at the end, Kevin. But just to provide some feedback, at least a context and background on the 2 authors, this is really an interesting piece which is going to inform 1 or 2 of the future shows as well. So referencing Wikipedia, we learn that Jocko Willink is an American author, podcaster, and retired U.S. Navy officer who served in the Navy SEALs. He achieved a number of military awards, including the Silver Star and Bronze Star. Jocko Willink is also co-founder of management consulting firms. So here's where the interesting pieces stand out. So first author, co-author, ex-Navy SEAL, in the management consulting space. Leif Babin, the other co-author of the book, is also a fellow retired decorated Navy SEAL. And referencing Wikipedia here as well, we learned that Leif Babin is a co-founder of Echelon Front, a leadership development services company where he serves as a leadership instructor, speaker, and executive coach. So both of them, ex-Navy SEALs, both sitting in this incredible space of leadership and executive coach, Kevin.
Craig, what's interesting is if you consider just the background that you mentioned that these guys are from, and it's not the first time I've heard, people from well-established armies and leaders of people where they write about leadership. And when you hear it from that context, you kind of go, that they are at the forefront of learning what leadership is really like. So it's going to be interesting to unpack this.
So a nice segue into the next section that I prepared here, and really, I want to set the context as to why two ex-American Navy SEALs have actually published more than one book, and why they're both in the business of leadership development and management consulting. So I did some investigation as to why Navy SEALs have such great leadership capabilities, Kevin. I came across a paragraph that explains this trait quite vividly. The paragraph is from a book titled 8 Leadership Lessons from Navy SEALs, and it reads as follows. Navy SEALs are regarded as one of the most prestigious and elite military squads today. At the core of their success is a belief that leadership is the most important thing on the battlefield, where life and death decisions can happen at any given moment. This approach to leadership is again explained in another book titled Never Enough, a Navy SEAL commander's 3 pillars of authentic leadership, these being described as excellence, agility, and meaning. And this particular book was written by Mark Hayes, a former commanding officer of Navy SEAL 2. So here we've got 3 different books titled around the leadership principle, and all 3 authors actually emanate out of the Navy SEAL squadrons, Kevin. These 2 books are definitely books that I'd like to try and find some book summaries on, because just through the skim read that I've done, there's some fascinating principles that I believe are worth reviewing as a series on our leadership show.
Yeah, and Craig, I've often, because I work in the capacity I do, people often ask, so tell me what leadership is. And very often people try and complicate what it is. And I love that it's just simply excellence, agility, and meaning. And one of the sentiments I use around leadership is great leaders create great leaders. That's it.
Lovely. Yeah.
And, if you take that approach, it's nice. It's a nice, obvious road forward.
I do like that. So just now to go back to your question on what the book tells us about the dichotomy of leadership. The book is structured in essence to help leaders recognize the leadership dichotomies and actually to find some kind of equilibrium between the opposing forces, that being the aggressive but cautious force, but the disciplined but not rigid force. And the most important here is being a leader and a follower. So 3 lovely themes emanating out of those dichotomies there. I'll just reiterate them again. Dichotomies of opposing forces. First being aggressive but cautious. Second being disciplined but not rigid. And finally, being a leader and a follower, Kevin.
What's just a quick, Craig, but because when people hear aggressive but cautious, a lot of people might not understand that, but I completely understand what it's saying, because as the aggressive force that as a leader, that's required from a leader, aggression doesn't mean anger, but it can specifically mean with absolute force and with vigor, but with cautiousness on who you letting behind or whose toes you stepping on. Be cautious on how you are aggressing. And the same with discipline, but not rigid. It's my partner always says to me, he's always so dumbfounded with the absolute discipline I have to get stuff done. And which I'm to me, I'm just well, I got to get it done. I don't have an option. But he always looks at it and says, it's amazing the amount of discipline you have to get stuff done. And it does. But in that discipline, you kind of, without being rigid and without being an asshole half the time,
Yes.
how can I be very disciplined and get it done, but get it done forcefully? But yeah, it's interesting.
So Kevin, the book covers three broad themes. These are firstly balancing people, then the balancing the mission, and then balancing yourself. And within each of these three themes, there are a number of key points that we have unpacked. So for today, we're going to look at balancing people and balancing the mission. Next week, we'll look at balancing yourself, and then I'll bring some of the aspects of those other two books into that conversation as well. So yeah, starting with theme one, balancing people. The first point that we note here is that the ultimate dichotomy in leadership is to care deeply for each individual in the team, while at the same time accepting the risks necessary to accomplish the mission. So it's about being the caring leader, but understanding that there are risks associated with being caring and being prepared to live with those risks. And here we learn that the true leader must find that balance between building powerful, strong relationships with his or her subordinates and recognizing that there actually is a job to do that might put the very same people that the leader cares about under a huge risk, Kevin. And an example of this in modern business is that you may actually have to fire someone who's a good subordinate in order to keep the business alive, in order to make it profitable, or to make the rest of the team more productive. So that particular subordinate, as good as they may be, may not necessarily be the right fit for the task at hand at that particular point in time.
Craig, but as you're speaking through it, one of the things that come to mind is the don't misplace my quietness for weakness, right?
Yes.
And essentially, and I think that's what's balancing people is often you can be nice to a point, and then you're going to reach my boundary, and then I'm going to inform you about my boundary, and then don't get mad because you've now stepped over my boundary. But up until that point, I'm going to allow for that balancing act to
yes. Yes.
But I will put a boundary in place when it's reached. Yeah.
The second point of theme one here is own it all, but empower others. And this is really about finding the right balance where people have had enough guidance to actually execute, but at the same time, some freedom to make decisions and take ownership on those executable actions, Kevin. The role of the leader here is to explain the broad goal and this beautiful concept that we talk about so often, particularly associated with purposes, the why of the mission. So it's about allowing subordinates to actually take ownership and plan that respective execution while setting boundaries with clear, simple, concise directions. And this is really about taking ownership and micromanaging when the team gets off course. So being there, allowing some of that flexibility, but being able to step in and guide through to the definitive endpoint when it's a course deviation. A great example of this in modern business is that leaders often micromanage every single aspect of, for instance, a launch, turning themselves into bottlenecks of the operation and their subordinates into robots who just sit around and wait to be told what to do, Kevin. If leaders actually explain the why and the goals of the mission, the team definitely are able to answer the questions and find solutions themselves, instead of constantly relying on the instruction of the leader.
Yeah, it's such a fine line, Craig, because I think of many projects that we work on, and you want to get it right, so and we have that sentiment that like no one's going to do it as well as I do it. So it's a very fine line with delegating and still keep having a handle on things.
But it goes to your point that great leaders make great leaders, and if you're not empowering, you're never going to enable that individual to become a great leader.
And Craig, I think what just worth mentioning is when you delegate, and sometimes when people don't realize this, is putting it out, putting it into someone's hand as trustworthy. Like I'm trusting you with this, right? Very often, people will surprise you. People will show up, right? There are times where people won't, but when you have communicated the why and they have a clear alignment to what it is you're doing, and you put it in their hands, very often, 9 times out of 10, I've experienced people will actually show up, and sometimes they'll do better than you anticipated. So it starts with you as the leader.
And when you understand the why and buy into it, then you get that collective grouping of working to a common cause and purpose and vision for the business. And that inevitably is definitely the first step to success there. Kevin, the third point on theme 1 is to be resolute but not overbearing. And this is about leaders finding that balance between standing firm and enforcing the rules versus giving ground and allowing the rules to be bent. And we learn here that leaders shouldn't be too lenient, setting high standards for the team to achieve greatness, but also they cannot become overbearing, domineering, or inflexible on matters of little strategic importance. And for me, that's really a great point of reference there, on matters of little strategic importance. So it's about filtering through and understanding what has got strategic importance in the organization and working around that, and then what are the other supportive activities and layers of thinking there. And Kevin, as a leader here, you need to prioritize the areas where standards cannot be bent, explaining the why again, the benefits, and then obviously the negative consequences of not following them. And it's important though, to allow some slack in these less critical areas for the subordinate leaders to take ownership and actually demonstrate their emerging leadership capabilities as well, Kevin. And an example of this in modern business is that leaders often focus too much on enforcing these trivial policies, such as, for instance, the no-phone meetings, instead of prioritizing stricter standards in more crucial areas of the business, such as company-wide implementation of new or unfamiliar software that actually will help produce and increase productivity overall, by helping the subordinates understand the why and the benefits behind this change.
Craig, one of the things that I, as one of the crutch or catchphrases that I, not a crutch, but catchphrases I've actually used in a lot of leadership engagement is, and when you first hear it, many people disagree. But when you start really paying attention to it, you start realizing, oh wow, this is synonymous with behavior, and that is the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And it speaks to the resolute but not overbearing. Is when you set that standard and you kind of go, this is the standard I'd like, and this is how we're going to stick to what we do. The only when you tell someone you haven't met the standard, it perfectly communicates. There doesn't have to be a conflict moment. There doesn't have to be disagreement. It's just beautifully, communicated that this is the standard of what we do, and please get it right.
Yeah.
It becomes a nice way of supporting exactly that point of being resolute and not overbearing. It's just factually this has been communicated already, and let's stick to how well we'd like, how this plays out.
Perfect. Kevin, the final point in our theme 1 is, this is a really contentious one, is knowing when to mentor and when to fire. It's an uncomfortable dichotomy for leaders to face, as they often must do everything possible to help develop and improve the performance of individuals on the team, but they must also let people go when they do not have what it takes to get the job done. An important point to note is that most underperformers don't necessarily need to be fired. They actually just need to be led. And once all efforts are made to actually help these underperforming employees improve, if those initial efforts have failed, then a leader does have to make the tough call and let that person go, so that their presence doesn't have a consequential negative effect on everybody else's performance. Again, an example of this in modern business is that leaders must remember that the performance of the team trumps the performance of the single individual. And investing too many resources in an individual that really doesn't improve means others that doesn't improve means that others are actually being ignored. And the risk here is that it actually impacts on the entire mission. So if individuals can't be successfully transferred into other areas of the business, unfortunately, they do need to be let go, Kevin. That is a reality.
Craig, and I think one of the measurements that you can put in place is the will versus skill quadrants, right? To understand, does the person have the skill to do it, and do they have the will? And having that open sort of conversation with people to kind of go, this is how we're going to measure the next 3 months and the next 6 months. And let's keep each other accountable to what we say we're going to do. And if that's not being met, then it's just a conversation of saying, well, you don't have the will to change. You don't have the will to kind of meet us where we need to go. I don't think this is.
Yeah, there's no good mutually beneficial relationship in place there.
Yeah. And essentially, a lot of time, and just from hearing it from a lot of leaders, is that it becomes a conflict conversation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict conversation. Some people just are not passionate about the environments they find themselves in. And that's cool. If you're not passionate about it, go work somewhere where you are passionate. It doesn't mean you've got to be and force your way through it.
And Kevin, I really like that, because it does talk to that particular point around if you can deploy them elsewhere in the organization, because some people may find their passion point elsewhere in the business, but even then, if they can't find it in other areas of the business, obviously they then need to be let go.
And 9 times out of 10, Craig, it's when someone's not passionate in what it is they're doing or how they're delivering, you're actually doing them an injustice to hold on to them and keep them there because you like them, or because you think they have a skill. At the end of the day, people are going to thrive when they feel like they're thriving. And if they don't, be adult enough to have that conversation and realistic enough if this is serving the environment or not.
And again, it's such a good point, because if you are trying to keep them in place and trying to push through the point where you think that they're going to change, you're actually harming them and the organization and the colleagues in the group there.
Yeah.
Moving to theme 2, some interesting points here, Kevin. Theme 2 is balancing the mission. And the first point that we actually note here is train hard, but train smart. Leaders can't avoid the dichotomy of training. Unfortunately, the too easy training that doesn't stretch the capabilities of the participants does minimize their improvement, though, whilst too overwhelming training actually diminishes the lessons that they could learn from. Kevin, we learned that leaders must technically train the team very hard, simulating the immense challenges of real life and applying pressures to decision makers so that they don't get humbled when things spin out of control, but not too hard, getting trainees demoralized. So again, that's the two extreme ends. And for this to happen, training really must be structured around 3 key principles. And the first job being that it must be realistic. It must be based upon scenarios that are actually likely to occur in real life in the business, with takeaways immediately being applicable to the team's mission. The second is to focus on the fundamentals. What are those battle-tested tactics that don't change, that help move the business forward? And then the third is to be repetitive, where each person gets better with iterations and brings their best self to the table each and every single time. An example of this in modern business is that although there's nothing better than a real-world experience, the only way to prep junior leaders is to train them. That's a reality. Placing them in tough scenarios that will prepare them for those real-world challenges, Kevin.
Craig, and many people disagree with me on this point, and I've seen it in real time, happening in real time. But from a leader's perspective, touching on that, be realistic. When you give unrealistic expectations to people and they fail constantly at it, you're also demeaning their efforts, right? So it becomes almost a habit-formed scenario of watch me fail and watch me fail daringly. And that's great. Like, failing is good and learning from it is good. But as the leader, you're not balancing much if you keep people in a position of failure the whole time. You have to make it so they can actually find some kind of evidence to support that they're actually winning at something.
Yeah, because that's quite a destructive trait if you just, enabling that to happen the whole time with no support and.
Yeah, and I use that because often in sales teams, for example, you've reached, the target for that month, and then suddenly the target is pushed out by like 20 to 30% bigger than it was last month. You're going, that's great, because I get that, we should expand and we should do better. But careful you don't put people into positions where they just completely burnt out and they lose interest and they don't want to thrive purely based on the unrealistic expectation of it. So it's a very fine balance.
And I love the point of reference you make to setting targets, because, you know, shareholders expect a 20% compounded year-on-year growth every single year, and they really don't give a damn about where the global economies are, where the industry sector cycle is, and things like that. So, you know, when leadership is accepting that there has to be a continuous growth of 20%, it is just immediately putting a negative veil over the team. And I see this with friends of mine in senior leadership positions in internationally owned businesses, where the top-down command of that is the number that you need to go for is just totally unrealistic in a marketplace that we face today.
Yeah, it's great. And I think maybe, you know, the economy and there should be very many factors that you are measuring what those targets should be related to. To just go, you know, well, this is going to look good for shareholder capacity. I'm like, that's not the best approach to setting targets in the first place.
Correct. So yeah, we reference our aggressive point here, Kevin. The second point to theme to here is we note it's to be aggressive, not reckless. And here the point tells us that being aggressive on execution is not always the answer. It must be balanced with that logic and a detailed analysis of the risk-reward proposition, Kevin. A point that you definitely agree with is that being passive as well being passive does allow problems to escalate out of control. So we know that problems are not going to solve themselves, and as such, a leader therefore must be aggressive on implementing solutions, but this has to be balanced with that caution and careful consideration to ensure that they mitigate excessive risk and implement some really great rewards at the end of the day. A great modern day example or modern business example is that the modern entrepreneur's inherent aggressive attitude default pushes the teams to the test, solves problems, and capitalizes on opportunities. However, while failing to plan for contingencies, remaining detached and unemotional. And this approach inevitably leads to a failed business. Firstly, a destructive team and a failed business, Kevin.
Craig, what's interesting about aggressive, not reckless is I think a sound leader with great emotional intelligence and self-awareness does that really well. Because, you know, when you've got the awareness of how that aggressive, forceful impact can be to that environment, the awareness around how your team members are coping, you know, can be really well recognized, and it becomes a force for good. But when you are reckless with it, you'll start having people fall off the bandwagon. And I think that's, you know, a good indicator is self-awareness and EQ, because being that force to get stuff done and solve is great. But if you're not aware of who you're whose toes you're stepping on, who you're offending in the process, not that great.
Definitely not. Kevin, so yeah, the third point of theme 2 is to be disciplined but not rigid. And this point tells us that while leaders do love discipline, which we know, they often forget that while disciplined following of operational procedures is a powerful tool for development of the business, excessive discipline definitely can kill free thinking and creativity. And we clearly know the consequences of an organization that's at the lifeblood of creativity and free thinking squeezed out of it. And we can all agree that standard operating procedures are powerful, proven, repeatable processes and methodologies. They do help organizations adjust and improve on their existing standard operating procedures instead of creating and crafting new plans from scratch each time. That said, though, the disciplined SOPs are not fixed, inflexible laws. They're definitely merely guidelines that do allow deviation from when acting with adaptability and common sense. So while the rigidity may well be perceived as the only path and no deviation from that, you do need to provide some kind of flexibility and allow guidelines again. And again, it's just about managing the control of the deviation, set some guidelines into the parameters of that deviation so that there at least is some kind of alignment to the core intent and why from the outset. Another good example of this in modern business is that following highly converting proven sales scripts too closely might actually hinder the chance to form a real long-term relationship with a customer or partner, making teams sound like soulless, perfect robots. And this actually talks perfectly to our conversation around AI and how that is dehumanizing organizations in that relationship interface with customers or prospects.
Yeah, and Craig, and I think that's why, sorry, I've got some background noise here. That's why, leadership in itself is considered a skill, because it's something that needs to be practiced. And, you often find where people who are too rigid in their approach or too rigid in getting it right, often are very difficult to work with. And we, in the team dynamics, when we do Enneagram workshops, you find that some of the Enneagram types are extremely they are orientated to perfection quite strongly in everything they do. And then you kind of go, okay, but it creates a lot of rigidity within team dynamics when you are. So yeah, it's also, again, a very fine line between getting it right and getting it done compared to, just being a spoke in the wheel the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. I do like the fourth and final point of theme too, which is hold people accountable, but don't hold their hands. And this point tells us that even though accountability is a powerful tool for leaders, it does, however, create a dichotomy. And we learned that this intrusive accountability can often be used as a helpful tool, but only when paired with education, again, about the why of the mission, and for the team to perform led by their own intrinsic drive without direct oversight. And it's interesting to see that the why really coming to the center of that point there again as well. The authors note that with enough oversight, Kevin, leaders can actually achieve a 100% success in execution, but definitely cautions that will fail developing trust with their subordinate leaders. As the operations grow and become more complicated, they'll definitely be physically unable to personally impact on everything, leading the teams towards certain failure, and obviously leading to burnout for the leader themselves as well. An example of this in modern business is that if leaders help employees understand why some actions may actually seem trivial, like logging a simple entry, this will actually help the company's long-term growth and eventually their own personal success. Occasional inspection will be a mere tool in the leader's arsenal, not the norm, and employees will log on to the entries because they'll actually hold themselves accountable. So taking that menial task of logging the simple entries with the understanding of the impact that has in the business in the long term, and the leadership's guidance in reaffirming the why, employees will lean in and actually take on that task themselves because they are now starting to hold themselves accountable.
Craig, and I think accountability is so important because
yes,
you can't get to, and I've learned this just out of purely having too much ego in my brand and trying to get everything done because I can do everything. And the pure simple notion is you can't do everything. So you have to be able to hand things over and delegate stuff. But when you do, delegating and empowering someone comes with accountability. You're accountable to me that I've delegated this to you, and we've agreed that this is the outcome that we're looking for. And I think a lot of people get that wrong because when things go wrong, to avoid conflict or to avoid a difficult conversation, I'm not going to say anything. I'll just do it on the side.
Yeah.
It's not useful. Accountability is part of having business and doing great business. It goes without saying.
Great. And also that's not a team effort behavior either. You're alienating the team when you're heading off on the side and doing it on your own. You're also not putting some leadership back into the team and helping bring others up to your particular perceived skill. But at the same time, you're not getting their point of view, which again could make you perform better.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, so I mean, in terms of takeaways for today, what are some of the key takeaways that we have for listeners?
Yeah, Kevin, so from those key themes and the various points that we've covered, some of the key takeaways note the following. Leadership requires balance between the many dichotomies, and we've definitely, covered a good few here. But above all, leaders must prioritize the success of their missions and the security of their team by mitigating risk and taking extreme ownership. Successful leaders absolutely care about their teams, but that they also have to understand and recognize the risks involved in order to accomplish this mission. A great leader accepts all responsibilities, but they also give space for subordinate leaders to shine and to take ownership from themselves. Being aggressive when executing doesn't mean being reckless. And the last point from today's conversation is, in order to be a good leader, you must be a good follower. Probably the most important point for me.
Yeah, and I think what stands out about that last point is, just because you are the leader it doesn't mean you know everything, right? So sometimes
absolutely, Kevin, gosh, yes.
You got to learn to follow and know your weak spot. And it's like, well, that's not my bag. It's not my bag of tricks. So I'm willing to learn.
Yes.
But yeah, it's an interesting topic, the dichotomy of leadership. Craig, I've got a nice quote to go with this. The leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. And that's from Simon Sinek.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful reference. And then obviously, from the master himself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Craig, thank you for today's show. And looking forward to finishing off these key topics around the dichotomy of leadership. Guys, please remember to like and share, and tune into the Lunchtime series every Wednesday and Thursday. For myself and Craig, have a fantastic week. Craig, I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a great week ahead. Look forward to it.
Cheers for now. Bye.